The National Brucellosis and Tuberculosis Eradication Campaign, BTEC, was formed in 1984, comprising of Commonwealth CVOs, all their delegates, and also people from the Commonwealth Department of Finance and the Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics. A single financial representative of all the states was included, and 3 members of the Cattle Council of Australia, representing the northern industry and the southern industry, including the dairy farmers. Another person with a national perspective was also included, ensuring that all parties were considered when making policies and that both economic and social implications were fully represented. This committee was responsible for the initiation of the eradication scheme and implemented a number of procedures, including mandatory in-field tuberculin testing, which was made possible by an expansion and increase in veterinary laboratories throughout the country, even in remote areas, the culling of infected individuals, and the complete destocking of properties with high infection rates. The continued testing and quarantine of herds where affected individuals were diagnosed over a period of 18 months, at which point, if a herd tested negative, the stock would be declared bovine tuberculosis free and the quarantine would be lifted. All farmers were given the same funding, resources, and assistance to ensure equitability. Increased surveillance was implemented at abattoirs by increasing the number of samples needed for testing and analysis. Water buffalo populations were inserted with trackers and are continuously monitored and tracked. An emergency response plan was then introduced, with a plan of action for if bovine tuberculosis were ever reintroduced into the country. This was based on past experience and analysis. There are many risks and challenges involved with the eradication of bovine tuberculosis. For one, wildlife reservoirs. Not only is the culling of a wildlife reservoir controversial, but once a bacteria has spilled over into the wildlife species, it is much harder to control and eradicate. Additionally, once entering the wildlife sector, this bacteria can enter into the environment, lying dormant in the soil, making it again harder to eradicate. Weather patterns change the prevalence of the disease, with animal stress and condition decreasing increases in bovine tuberculosis cases. This is often dependent on the environment. Additionally, severe weather conditions, such as heavy rainfall and monsoon seasons, which occur at certain times of the year, make access to animals which are both domestic and wild difficult for intervention teams to access. With increased trade and access to imported products, globalization has become a huge risk to the spread of bovine tuberculosis across countries and across the world, both through animal product trade and the wildlife trade. Livestock vaccinations do not prevent the infection of the animal, and once injected with the vaccination and tested with a tuberculin test, the animal will show as positive for bovine tuberculosis, thus rendering the vaccination highly ineffective. Wildlife conservation is critical, with bovine tuberculosis infecting many threatened animals, and also with threatened species being hosts, endangering populations through the culling and the illness itself. Stakeholder opinions are one of the biggest challenges to overcome, with everyone involved having different opinions of the correct way to act, and governments not being able to implement effective plans without full stakeholder support. In light of these risks and challenges, the following suggestions are made. Instead of mass culling reservoir species, targeted testing should be performed, with those that are positive for bovine tuberculosis being vaccinated and culled. Vaccines to wildlife reservoirs can also be administered through specific wildlife baits. For example, berried baits would be effective for badgers, and molasses cookies would be effective for ungulates. A high level of slaughter surveillance should be in place, with large numbers of samples being submitted for analysis before the distribution of meat, whilst also allowing for the determination of sites of infection. Livestock movement and border policies should also be in place, with restricted movement for livestock near areas where wildlife reservoirs are known to exist, and restricted movements between herds. Border restrictions should also be placed on trade, with limited trade to no trade being allowed for produce from infected areas. Border testing of products should also be implemented, and a restriction of importation of wildlife that could be a potential host for bovine tuberculosis. Research should continue for an effective vaccination for cattle. However, vaccination should also be implemented for wildlife reservoirs in order to stop the spread from wildlife to livestock, as well as from wildlife to wildlife, thus reducing the impact on already threatened species. Culling should be done on properties with infected animals, with complete destocking occurring where prevalence is high. The culling of wildlife populations without testing first should be done as a very last resort, when other options are not going to be effective or there is no time remaining. The community should be involved in the policy making and funding of plans, as what was done in Australia, with the public being educated and informed on the strategies and matters at hand throughout the process. An emergency response strategy for the event of a severe outbreak should be in place for all countries, with plans based on analysis, strategy, and coordination. The plan should focus on major outbreaks of the disease and should draw guidance from effective eradication schemes such as that in Australia. In conclusion, infectious disease at the wildlife-livestock-human interface threatens the health of livestock, wildlife, and humans, whilst accounting for significant economic losses in a variety of ways for both individuals and countries. The maintenance and control of bovine tuberculosis requires the understanding of complex systems influencing both human livelihoods and wildlife health. I thank you for your time and for listening to me today. I hope that this has been an educational presentation and you have learned a fair amount about bovine tuberculosis. Thank you.